Hello, my name is Kiri and I'm a flower farmer here in Western Washington in Zone 8A. Today is part 4 of a 5-part series where I am talking all about farm accounting, specifically flower farm accounting, and this is the last educational bit of the series before we talk about how much money I made, how much money I spent, my real numbers. So just a reminder before we jump in that I do have an accounting and tax administration background, but I am not a licensed CPA and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not your licensed CPA or lawyer. So this is just generalized information that you can take to your CPA if you have questions about your specific tax or accounting situation. So this is not tax advice, it's just nuggets of info for you. So this video is all about managerial accounting, and more specifically cost accounting, which is a type of managerial accounting. So we already talked about financial statements, which is the most common type of accounting that I think people encounter if they're not actually running a business. And that's financial reports and those statements that show profitability and things like that. But cost accounting is a different kind of accounting that doesn't really have any rules actually. So financial accounting looks at GAAP accounting principles and make sure that they follow the rules for that. But a cost accounting you can kind of use as you need to, and it's really for internal users, so it's for business owners or managers or decision makers in a company to figure out how profitable certain things are. So many accountants will tell you that this is the most difficult kind of accounting, and I have to agree, I do think it is very difficult. Because there's kind of no rules, and so it's really figuring out what works for you and what information you're trying to pinpoint and what you're trying to achieve with it. So although this information isn't used like for tax reporting or for your financial statements, it is really useful for internal controls. So making sure that you're being efficient and that you're not spending money in ways that end up costing you. So I'm using the word costs a lot, and really what is that? So there's 4 different basic types of costs. There's direct and indirect costs, and then there's fixed and variable costs. So direct costs can be traced directly to your product. So that would be for tulips, that would be the bulbs, right? Or your seeds or things like that. Indirect costs are the costs that can't be directly traced to a product. So those are typically allocated across the products. So that's when you hear the word overhead, that's really trying to incorporate those different indirect costs. Fixed costs are those costs that don't vary with the level of production of your goods. So that would be something like your rent on your building, the cost of your roadside stand, something like that. Variable costs are those costs that do change as you produce more or less of your products. So an example of that would be your wrapping paper for your bouquets or your harvesting labor, things like that. And so it's really up to you to figure out how much of a nitty-gritty analysis that you want to do, because I could allocate the cost of every staple that I put into the wrapping paper on my bouquets, but it's not really cost effective for me to do that, although I could. So I allocate those as indirect overhead type costs, but you could make that a direct variable cost if you'd like to. So now that we know all of the different costs, let's run through a real example of cost accounting for a specific product. So something like tulips is a really good case example of this because the bulbs are very expensive. So if you aren't pricing your tulip stems correctly, you could end up having a loss on that sale. So you would do all of that work to sell those tulips and then actually be costing yourself money. So this is a really good example to walk through. It's also a lot simpler because the costs are material. So, the cost of filler type flowers like dill, those seeds are like pennies on the dollar. So it kind of doesn't make sense, in my opinion, to go so nitty-gritty in analyzing those on a per stem basis. But something like tulips, dahlias, ranunculus that have an expensive bulb cost are, in my opinion, very worth spending your time analyzing. And I want to start this segment by saying thank you to people who commented on my very first video where I was selling tulips. And I agree, I was underpricing my tulips, but I'm going to caveat that by saying that I was following the advice in this book, which I should find it. But basically she says that you should expect to sell single stem tulips at a loss, as a loss leader to attract business to your company, you know, as kind of like a, hey, I'm open for the season, I've got some flowers, generate that interest, and then keep people coming to you all season long. She does say that, you know, the fancier tulips are where you're going to make some more money, but that is part of the reason why I had priced myself so low, and I was also being bad and comparing my product to grocery store tulips, which that is an apples to oranges comparison, and it essentially what you see at the grocery store is wholesale pricing. So don't compare yourself to the grocery store because you're not the grocery store. So I did up my price eventually, and I think I had at that time very limited knowledge on how much time it would take me to harvest, you know, a lot of those input costs. But I think that the price I ended up at was pretty good. I'll show you actually why that price makes sense in this scenario. So just a caveat, this analysis is using information that I now know after going through a season of selling tulips. So I didn't know how long it was going to take me to plant tulips, harvest them, arrange them, sell them. I didn't know any of these things. And so now I feel that I can make an educated estimate on how much time it takes me to do those things, because although I didn't keep the best records, I have a general idea of how long it took me to do these things. So these are kind of rough estimates, but you know, just something to keep in mind, that you should be tracking how much time it takes you to plant, how much time it takes you to harvest, how much time it takes you to arrange, and how much time it takes you to sell. So let's go a little bit nitty-gritty here and look at a specific tulip variety. So we're going to look at Exotic Emperor tulip. That is an early blooming double tulip that is white. So this is a little bit of a fancier tulip, so I believe that doubles and parrots and fringe can command a higher price than a single tulip, so we're going to go with the higher price on this one. So the bulbs, I ordered my bulbs from ADR this year. I got 100 bulbs for $44. So that works out to 44 cents per bulb. The other thing that you can't forget to include is the freight charge. For 1,800 bulbs, I had a freight charge of $212, and that's going to be a big chunk. And so that works out actually to a 12-cent premium on every single bulb that I receive from them. So one Exotic Emperor tulip bulb actually cost me 56 cents to get to my house. Then we also have to consider compost, fertilizer, and irrigation. Thankfully, tulips don't require fertilizer. They also don't require irrigation where I live because our winters are very wet. So that's not a cost that I have to worry about. And I didn't truck in any compost this season, so I'm just reusing compost that I had available from last season. So not a cost there, but something that you should consider for other crops. So now let's look at the labor. So this is a little bit tricky when you are like a sole proprietor, or you know, kind of doing all of these things on your own and you don't have employees, because your labor costs aren't going to be tracked in your bookkeeping software because you're not paying somebody a salary or, you know, an hourly wage for work that they have done that's logged in a timesheet. So my advice to you is to log your time in a timesheet as if you are an employee, so that you can see how much time you're spending on things. And I will caveat that because I do YouTube, everything takes longer. So I'm quite slow actually working through things because I'm recording, and I do also enjoy it, so I don't often rush to get things done because I'm kind of on the journey of growing and picking and selling flowers. So there's obviously improvements that I can make, but my planting labor this last year, I planted all of my tulip bulbs, which worked out to 1,900 tulip bulbs, because I also ordered some from Jake from Wholesale for the Small Scale, and I also picked up some from Costco. It took me 5 hours to plant all of those tulips in my raised beds here, so that works out to 4 cents per bulb. And I'm pricing my labor at $15 just so I have a standard. You could price your labor at whatever you would like to. In my opinion, it does kind of make sense to price your labor at whatever you would pay somebody to do that as an employee. You know, if you're preparing to hire somebody to do those things that you don't want to do, knowing what it costs at that rate that you would pay somebody is very helpful. So I would estimate, based on my rough information that I tracked, that it takes me about an hour to pull the tulips out of the ground when they're ready, wash them off, and cut the bulbs off for about 5 bunches at a time. So that works out to 30 cents per stem of my time to prep them and get them ready to arrange. And then arranging labor is very quick and easy with tulips because, you know, maybe you need to strip off some leaves, get some dirt off of them, but otherwise you're just bunching them and wrapping them in paper. So that's about half an hour for 5 bunches, I would estimate. So that works out to 15 cents per stem. And this is where my business strategy kicks in. So my selling labor, I would estimate, is about 30 minutes per 5 bunches of tulips, and that includes me opening up the stand, making sure my signage is up to date, making sure my inventory is up to date and square, and then taking pictures of the tulips and posting photos on social media. So I don't have to go to a market and spend a lot of time selling bouquets, which that's why I do the roadside stand. So my selling labor is actually very low because I just pop open the stand, make a post on Facebook, and call it good. So that works out to about 15 cents per stem. Those are the costs that I can tie directly to my product at a very micro nitty-gritty scale, so per stem basis. And so these are considered variable costs, right? So these costs are going to change based on how many stems that I harvest or plant. There's some things that are still variable, but it doesn't make sense to break down on the per stem basis. So something like the bouquet packaging makes more sense to break down on a per bouquet level, especially because the price really is so minuscule. So how do I find, you know, 1/10 of 5 cents for my wrapping paper, right, to get the per stem price? You know, it kind of doesn't make sense to do those types of things. Those should be calculated as well, though, because those do have a material cost to your product. My craft paper costs 5 cents per sheet. It's 18 by 18 brown craft paper that I got from Amazon. I got 2,000 sheets for $95. My logo sticker works out to be 8 cents per sticker, and my graphic designer ordered those for me, so that's why I got a good deal. And then rubber bands work out to be a penny per rubber band. So that works out to 14 cents per bouquet just on the packaging. I also could try to calculate the per staple price, but I'm not going to go there. So my variable costs, those things that I can directly identify that are related to getting a exotic emperor tulip from a bulb stage up to the point that it is selling to my customer, that cost me $1.20. But there is another calculation that we need to add in, which is overhead, right? So those fixed costs, right? The cost of building the stand, the buckets, the tools, all of those things that don't directly relate to that stem that I'm trying to sell somebody, but are necessary for me to be able to sell them a stem. So that would be all of our fixed overhead costs. We're also going to try to account for any bulb loss. So I had quite a bit of bulb loss this year to rot. You also want to consider stem loss. So not every single stem that you think you're going to have is going to actually be viable. Some tulips might fail to thrive. You might break a stem when you're harvesting it, or it might just be damaged by hail or something like that. So, you know, you gotta account for some of that loss. You also need to account for some unsold inventory. So you're not gonna sell out every single bouquet always. So that's a cost to you, right? Because you spent all that money buying the bulbs and all that time harvesting and arranging, and then it doesn't sell. Other fees that you might have if you are taking credit or debit cards is that 3% credit card processing fee. That's about what my Square processing fee works out to be, you know, and then you want to have money to buy more equipment and reinvest in the business. So really that's the purpose of building in some overhead, is so that you can have money to do all the other things beyond just buying tulips and selling them. There's a couple different approaches that you can take to calculate your overhead, and I'll talk about a few different ones and why most of them probably aren't going to work when you're at such a small scale. So overhead is really an estimate. So it's based on real numbers, but you're trying to attach some amount of your fixed costs to some type of activity. So you can calculate overhead as, a percentage of sales. You can calculate it as related to the direct labor to getting that product ready to sell. So you would look at your fixed cost for the month of April, let's say in this tulip example, and then try to figure out how much time you spent harvesting tulips in April, and then allocate out your fixed costs as a dollar amount per the amount of labor that you have put into it. Most of us probably aren't tracking our labor like that, so that might not work. It doesn't work for me because I'm not tracking that at all. At this point, I will this next season. And the other kind of problem that I've hinted at quite a bit over the last few videos is that if your cash basis, your fixed costs are going to kind of be all over the place, right? So you may be buying assets that you expense if you've taken the de minimis safe harbor election, and so the fixed costs really kind of don't make sense in a way in this calculation. So something to keep in the back of your mind. The other thing that you can do is just to calculate overhead as a percentage of your sales. So you would look at prior year fixed costs and then divide that by prior year sales. If you do that and you're not profitable, then you're going to get a ridiculous overhead estimate that's really, it doesn't make sense. So I can't do that because I wasn't profitable this last year. So the way that I think makes sense to calculate overhead is to use like a predetermined overhead rate. And so retail is typically 20 to 25%. I don't know what farm overhead is, but think about the fact that we have so much equipment and things that are very necessary to invest in to be able to produce flowers for people to buy. So I'm going to say maybe a little bit of a higher overhead rate at about 30%. It's up to you to figure out what you're comfortable with, but that's what I'm going to use. And so I'm just going to do that as a percentage of my sale price. Another way that you can calculate overhead if you really don't have a lot of information to build on, which is what I had done last year when I didn't know how long it would take me to harvest. I didn't know anything really besides how much I paid for my bulb. You can look at the wholesale price based on the Boston wholesale price sheet and multiply that by 2.5. So that should give you your selling price at the 60% profit margin. And I was watching Little Bird Bloom. She has a YouTube channel and she was talking about having a profitable florist business. And her suggestion on the florist industry pricing formula that she says is standard is the wholesale price times 3 plus 20%. So that's a lot more of an aggressive pricing strategy, which you can try if you are comfortable with that. Or, tricky trick here, 2.5 of whatever the grocery store near you is trying to sell tulips for. Because that's pretty much wholesale pricing, right? So last year I settled on $2.29 for my fancy tulip pricing. So any of my doubles, my fringes, and my parrots were priced at that per stem. My overhead cost, 30% of that would be 69 cents. So we would add that on to our total variable cost, which we already figured out, which is $1.20. So per stem, Exotic Emperor, which is a fancy double tulip, costs me $1.88 to get it to the selling point. If I sell it at $2.29 per stem, then that works out to 41 cents per stem profit, which is about 18% profit margin. As I said in the financial statements video, we are going for a net profit margin of 30 to 40%. So that is a bit lower. So I think this year I may up my price just a smidge, but it's a balancing act for me because I'm trying to sell at the $20 price point. So I'm adjusting how many stems I'm putting in the bouquet to keep it at $20. And really it's not $20 of a sale price, it's actually $18.37 because I separately itemize my sales tax amount, which is 8.9%, because in my state it must be separately stated on the receipt for the customer. When I post it for sale, all my signage says, $20 sales tax included, but if they check out digitally and they get a receipt, it's going to say that actually the bouquet was $18.37 plus 8.9% tax, which comes out to $20. I have to find how many stems I can sell at $18.37 to hit my 30% profit margin goal. So let's just run through that real quick. So if I up my selling price to $3 per stem, then my total cost, including the adjusted overhead percentage, that's a percentage of sales, right, would become $2.10, which would work out to a 90-cent profit, which would be a 30% profit margin. $18.37 selling price for bouquet divided by 3. That works out to a little bit over, to like a fraction of a stem, so we'll just round down to 6 stems per $20 bouquet. So this is, where we gotta figure out, our customer's gonna find double tulip bouquets that are 6 stems worth $20. I don't know. We're gonna have to figure it out. I may go from selling 8 stems per $20 bouquet to 7 this year. But I do want to stay at the $20 mark because it's really easy for somebody to just pull out a $20 bill, drop it in the box, and call it good. So we'll see. I'm not sure. When I first started my business, I took this advice a little bit too extreme and was like, yep, I'm going to undersell myself on this. So I think that there is a balancing between the profitability on something like a tulip, versus it being a loss leader. I think you definitely can make some profit on tulips, but in my opinion, I don't know if you can expect to get 30% profit margin on that, but I would definitely expect to get that on ranunculus. And so this is kind of where doing those calculations for different item types is going to help you find out what is profitable. And so, something like ranunculus, I already know, I haven't even done this calculation, but I already know that ranunculus are going to be way higher profit margin than tulips. Maybe that is okay for me to have a product that is very profitable to overcompensate for something like tulips that aren't as profitable, but people still do really love tulips. And there is value to tulips because they are very reliable. You're probably not going to lose a tulip crop to bad weather like you would maybe ranunculus. So, kind of some benefits and drawbacks to consider. So I hope that analysis was helpful. Again, this type of nitty-gritty analysis is really up to you to decide if it's worth your time. And I started out flower farming thinking that I need to do this analysis for everything because I found that information was missing from all the resources that I looked at. And after spending a year going through this process, certain things I think that you should do this profitability calculation on, like tulips or ranunculus, those things that have a very expensive seed or bulb purchase. You could even do it for sunflowers or dahlias. That's a good example there. But those kind of filler flowers like dill or yarrow, those types of things, my opinion is that you don't need to spend so much time doing that. It may be better to look at a variance analysis to see how many stems do I expect to harvest and sell and make the money on that, and how many do I actually harvest, and how many do I actually sell, what do I actually make off of those, and is that worth my time? Could I use that space for something else that might give me more stems that are more profitable? You also don't have to look at just the flower by flower basis. You could look at it as like a bouquet type. Something like yarrow on its own doesn't have a lot of value, but it does have value as a bundle in a mixed bouquet, right, with those other elements. And this is also where you can analyze your price per bouquet to see, where's my break even on how much time I spend making that bouquet and how much seed I have invested in the bouquets. You could even do that by growing season. So, your tender annuals, look at your seed costs for that, how much time you spend harvesting, planting, and arranging those, and then figure out your break even for that, and then how much is my goal net profit. So there's all kinds of ways to look at it. I encourage you to try different ways and see what works for you and what doesn't, and what you have time to accommodate. So now that you have a foundational understanding of some of the accounting concepts that I'm going to address in my profitability analysis, sales revenue, and all that for my business, let's jump into it. It'll be linked right here when it's available. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.